Hello and welcome to another episode of Henry VIII the Reign, an Old Tale of Wives. And this episode is titled The Sack of Rome to the Fall of Wolsey. Thomas Wolsey had ruled England for nigh on 20 years, with precious little reference to Parliament, which had sat, 2 or 3 times in the entire period. His rule over England, as we've seen, was absolute. It was uncontested. There was no one to challenge his rule, least of all that nitwit King Henry VIII. During his tenure, Wolsey convinced himself that he could rule all of Christendom, just as the popes of yesteryear had done. But in wider Christendom, there were those that were wiser than he. They were strategists, pragmatists, and they were women. There were women who could challenge him, women who would challenge him. And in the end, they did challenge him. And when they did, Wolsey lost.
As we have already seen, King Francis of France was taken prisoner at the Battle of Pavia in 1525 and held prisoner in Spain by King of Spain, Charles V. Following Francis' ransomed release in 1526, Thomas Wolsey was instrumental in forming the League of Cognac, which pitched England, France, and significantly the papacy, along with various other states, against Charles V and his Habsburg Empire. We've also seen how Wolsey planned to bond his new alliance with Francis by having Henry VIII married to Francis's sister, Marguerite of Angoulême. Wolsey intended to be rid of Catherine of Aragon by having her marriage to Henry VIII annulled, and so also be rid of Habsburg influence in England. Catherine, however, was Charles's aunt. That is to say, Charles's mother Joanna was Catherine's sister. But his plans had been scuppered when he discovered that Marguerite, unbeknown to him, had already married the King of Navarre. In the circumstances, a wise move from a wise woman. Wolsey was in trouble, as we saw, because he had already created a deep animosity between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. It also made an enemy, a bitter enemy, of her nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Christendom. For his own profit and aggrandizement, he intended Henry VIII to formally ally with France and to marry into French royalty. But with Marguerite married elsewhere, who now? Where could he find a royal-blooded mademoiselle to marry his nitwit king? Enter Anne Boleyn, or perhaps more accurately, Anne de Boulogne. She was the daughter of Henry VIII's senior diplomat, Thomas Boleyn, and with some fancy juggling of her ancestral pedigree was a descendant of royalty, both English and French. She was a descendant of King Stephen of England and Stephen's son Eustace, Count of Boulogne, who was deprived of his right to be king by the dastardly machinations of Henry II and his mother Matilda's conspirators. Well, that's what Wolsey would have told the social climbing Boleyn girl. And as for Henry, well, he'd believe left was right and night was day if Wolsey told him so. She, with sugar-coated promises from Wolsey, would be the next Queen of England, and would be the new queen just as soon as Wolsey rid Henry of Catherine of Aragon. The social climbing instincts that Anne had honed in France, she now put to use in England. But she quickly became impatient. She wanted to be queen when she was ready, not at the behest of Wolsey and the Pope. Wolsey didn't know it yet, but this Boleyn girl wanted Wolsey's power and influence for herself. Matters were about to get a whole lot worse for Wolsey. In 1526, following the release of King Francis, Wolsey had been instrumental in assembling the new League of Cognac. Indeed, he got himself into something of a huff because he wanted to call it the League of London, but in the end it carried the name of Francis's home city of Cognac. In any event, it was made up of France, England, various other states in Christendom, and headed by the Pope and the Papal States. They assembled the forces in northern Italy. Initially, the alliance was headed up under the command of Ludovico de' Medici, the mercenary leader of the mercenary company, the so-called Black Bands. On the other side, the imperial army was led by the Duke of Bourbon. There were raids, sieges, and skirmishes, but in the months before one of Christendom's most infamous catastrophes, tens of thousands of these armed men were living rough miles from home, freezing cold and with few places to sleep, little food, poor clothing, and no pay. Morale broke in Charles's imperial army. In a desperate state, some 30,000 rebelled against their leaders. To pacify them, in 1527, Bourbon led them to Rome to fight the enemy number one, the Pope himself. Under the auspices of the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, they pillaged the city, raped the inhabitants, men, women, and children, seized everything from the city's wealth that they could lay their hands on. This was their back pay, their wages, the wages of war, and the ruination is known to history as the sack of Rome, 1527, in brackets. Bourbon himself, leading his men and wearing his famous white coat, was easily picked out as a target by the enemy and shot dead. He was one of the first to be killed in the opening assault. His rampant troops, now leaderless, overran the city. They looted and destroyed monasteries, churches, and palaces of the clergy. Many of those who tried to defend the city suffered gruesome execution. The Pope himself was destined for the same fate, but he escaped along an elevated passage that linked, indeed still does link, the Vatican to the Castle San Angelo. There, Clement holed up with a few of his aides. But he was trapped, incarcerated in his refuge, a prisoner of Charles, captive in the Castle St. Angelo. He who Wolsey needed to annul the marriage of Catherine of Aragon to Henry VIII was held, imprisoned under threat of death in the name of Catherine's nephew. However, Wolsey had a plan. Wolsey usually did have a plan. The capture of the Pope presented another opportunity for the cunning, scheming cardinal to further his ambitions for control of the papacy. In his mind's eye, he espied a vacant papal throne. There was no one presently to don the papal tiara. As a result of the sack of Rome, there was no one available to lead the Roman Catholic Church. Wolsey was off. Impassioned, he was off to France to assume control of the Holy See. He departed England with the title of the King's Lieutenant, the powers of a plenipotentiary, and the pomp of a viceroy. So far as Henry VIII was concerned, at that stage, ostensibly to ratify the treaties of the previous April. George Cavendish, who was with Wolsey, describes their departure from London. He said that the cardinal, leaving his house in Westminster, wearing his cardinal's hat and other regalia, he passed through London, over London Bridge, preceded by a great number of gentlemen, 3 in rank, in black velvet livery coats, most with great chains of gold about their necks. Wolsey was followed by noblemen and gentlemen servants in French tawny livery coats embroidered front and back with the letters T and C. No, not top cap. Then his pack horses followed, and mules pulling carts and other carriages. The great train was protected by a multitude of guards bearing bows and spears. His own mule, accompanied by a spare, was trapped with crimson velvet upon velvet, and his stirrups made of copper and gilt. Before him 2 great crosses of silver, and 2 great pillars of silver, and the Great Seal of England. Cavendish doesn't mention it, but taking the Great Seal out of the kingdom was an act for which he would be later lambasted by his enemies. Cavendish, however, does go on to mention Wolsey's cloak bag, which was made altogether of fine scarlet cloth, embroidered over and over with cloth of gold, very richly, having a cloak of fine scarlet packed inside it. Away in front of the train, having already left London, were the Cardinal's harbingers, his forerunners, to organise in advance food and lodgings for the entourage. By the 14th of August he was at Amiens, where Francis had come to meet him. Wolsey had devised a scheme whereby he would take control and preside over the church from Avignon. He had since explained to Henry that this device was also for the advancement of your particular affair, the affair, of course, being the divorce. Within the detail of this plan was the assembly of all the cardinals who had not been taken prisoner to go to Wolsey in Avignon to prevent the government of the church becoming subservient to Charles. Wolsey intended to assume the full authority of the Pope during Clement's captivity. He would use this mission to ratify the treaties with the French and, in the name of the papacy, pronounce the king's marriage invalid. But Charles was prepared for him. He blamed the overmighty Wolsey for Christendom's woes and accused him of contriving the divorce to gratify his own ambitions. He entreated the Pope to invoke the legatine power conferred on the Cardinal of England, and at the same time he exonerated Henry. He said, "It is not to be presumed that His Serenity the King would consent to have her being Princess Mary, and her mother, Catherine, dishonoured, a thing in itself so unreasonable there is no example of it in ancient or modern history." That really was a pretty fair assessment of the situation. Back in England and with Wolsey away, Henry was spreading his wings. Cajoled by his prospective queen, unbeknown to Wolsey, on the 23rd of July, the king arrived at the Palace of Beaulieu near Chelmsford in Essex, which is now Newhall School. He had bought it from Thomas Boleyn in 1516, and was joined there by Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter, and a number of other nobles, including Thomas Boleyn. These visitors were no great friends of Wolsey, and had sown some seeds of doubt about the Cardinal's motive for being abroad. While Wolsey in France, rumours had found their way into print in England, and the reports also claimed that Princess Mary would marry Francis's second son, Henri. Anne had detected the first hints of Wolsey's duplicity. He had been using her. Time on from his sugar-coated promises, where was Gloriana? She was not good Queen Anne. She was not even married to the king, and worse, he was not divorced from the queen. She later riled at the cardinal, "But I've put much confidence in your professions and promises, in which I find myself deceived." Some of Henry's guests, who envisaged advancement for themselves, had also coaxed the king to take matters into his own hands. He dispatched his secretary, William Knight, to seek a dispensation for him to marry again without the annulment of his first marriage. Knight was instructed to meet with Wolsey at Campania. However, when the cardinal discovered what was afoot, he dashed off a letter to the king, urging Henry to halt the ruse. He said that Cardinal Giannucci, absentee Bishop of Worcester, was better qualified to serve Henry in his great matter than Knight, and that Giannucci had more experience of affairs in Italy, and the Italian was better placed to approach the pontiff. Wolsey stopped Knight from travelling on. He waited Henry's response, confident that with his urgent advice taken, Henry would call off the mission and that Wolsey could then dispatch Knight back home to England. His confidence was misplaced. Henry and Anne instead issued further orders, kept secret from Wolsey, for Knight to continue on to Rome. He now had a new purpose: to obtain dispensation for Henry to marry any woman, even one related in the first degree of affinity, through her licit or illicit intercourse. It was a reference to Anne and her sister Mary. Henry had an affair with a wanton sister some years earlier, and according to the law of the day, was thus related to her. Wolsey, however, could not find a ploy to delay Knight any longer, and he continued on his way towards Rome. For a decade and more, the cardinal had ruled England. He alone had made and enforced policy, the autocrat extraordinaire. It was he who had negotiated with the papacy. It was he, so he thought, who would decide when and where and to whom Henry would be remarried. Wolsey was worried now and must have sensed all was not well for him back in England. Despite all his papal aspirations for Christendom, he returned a pace across the Channel to reassert his authority. However, when he arrived, the welcome was cold almost. He found that Henry was now in Anne's thrall. She wanted this divorce infinitely more than its originator, the cardinal. Though he had promised it to her, Wolsey, as things stood, did not want this divorce at all. This woman and her French sponsors were usurping his power. He had underestimated the Lady de Boulogne. She would circumvent him, especially in all things French, and the French controlled his route to the papal tiara. Anne seduced politics into the bedchamber and continued with it between the sheets, a ploy that Wolsey could not match. The cardinal schemed to scupper the divorce proceedings until he could reorganize his sovereign's mind and be rid of the second Boleyn girl, as he had the first, her sister, the wanton Mary. But for the clergyman the reality was dawning. The Boleyns had filched his mastery of Henry, and were prizing possession of the royal sanction from him. At first Wolsey put a brave face on it all. On the first day of Michaelmas term, he made a speech to the Lords Temporal and Spiritual in the Star Chamber about the achievements in France. He said, "I have knit the realms of England and France together in such a perfect knot that it shall never fail." Certainly the merchants in England were not happy when they were warned to restrict trade to Calais only, and not export goods to Charles's dominions. The consequences would be financially crippling. In the meantime, William Knight had not succeeded in Rome with Henry's plan for a divorce. Wolsey's device to assume the papacy for himself was also proving a failure. The other cardinals were not interested, and no one turned up at Avignon. He sent instructions to his Italian agent, Gregory Casale. He must take over the great matter from Knight, or, if absolutely necessary, work with Knight and obtain a commission from Pope Clement for Wolsey to hold a trial in England with no appeal to Rome, and dispensation for Henry to marry Anne. Knight did manage to make written contact with the incarcerated Clement, but soon after that received news that the pontiff had escaped from Rome and taken refuge in relative safety 70 miles north at Orvieto in Umbria. Orvieto is a city in a spectacular location on a hill with steep and mostly vertical sides with a flat top. Thus began a mission, a sham, to bluff Henry that the cardinal was doing his utmost to serve his wishes. Missions that went back and forth to get Wolsey the authority that he considered necessary to annul Henry's marriage. However, before this pretense began on the 13th of January 1528, Clement and his advisers detailed what they considered to be the obvious procedure for addressing Henry's grievance. They said Wolsey should use his legatine authority or the General Commission to test the validity of Henry's marriage to Catherine. If Wolsey judged in Henry's favour, then Henry would be free to marry Anne Boleyn. In that scenario, they said, only if the second marriage were challenged need the matter be referred to Rome. And even, said the Pope, even if it got that far, the Pope will give sentence, and so judgment will be passed on the second marriage to the satisfaction of the whole world, to which neither Spaniard nor German can make objection. Utopia, surely, for these impassioned lovers. Historian and author J.J. Scarisbrick asks the questions. Why ask for so much to be settled in advance when so little might ever be in dispute? Why ask for such heavy weapons as decretals and legates when the Cardinal of York was, to Roman minds, already adequately equipped? That is to say, so far as the Pope was concerned, Wolsey had all the authority he needed to pronounce the marriage null and void on his own. He did not need any further intervention from Rome. Using that method, Anne and Henry could have been married in early 1528 instead of late 1532. Henry was either ignorant of the advice or lacked the chivalrous courage of true love. Or he was just a gullible nitwit. Whatever the case, Wolsey continued to play for time to rid his sovereign of the Boleyn woman. As it turned out, of course, Wolsey never did make a judgment on the marriage. That responsibility fell to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer almost 5.5 years later. To complicate matters further, Wolsey, during his 3 months at Amiens and Compiegne, had sent instructions to the English ambassadors in Spain, Edward Lee and Cardinal Giannuzzi, without the details being known to Henry. With their French counterparts, they were ordered to declare war on Charles. Charles rebuffed the declaration with a scathing attack on Wolsey. There was uproar in England. The announcement of war created havoc in the lucrative trading relations with Imperial Flanders. The merchants were shocked, and trade with a newly declared enemy became impossible, creating great swathes of unemployment across the country. Stephen Gardiner was included in the series of delegations to Pope Clement or veto, and eventually on the 8th of June, Gardiner and Casale obtained the decretal commission to allow the trial of Henry's divorce in England, with Campeggio and Wolsey presiding. The angry merchants had their way, and on the 15th of June 1528 a truce was signed with the Netherlands, but it did not extend to the war in Italy, which continued. 27th of October 1528, Cardinal Campeggio arrived, ostensibly to prepare for the trial. He found Henry determined to end his marriage to Catherine, and reported that an angel descending from heaven would be unable to convince him otherwise. No sooner had he arrived, however, than Catherine produced a copy of what was claimed to be a brief from Pope Julius II. It remedied all the defects in his bull of dispensation permitting Henry to marry her, even if her marriage with Arthur had been consummated, which she claimed it had not. The original of this brief, it was claimed, was in Spain. If it were genuine, because Henry's case relied on the defects of the original bull of dispensation, his cause was lost. In the end of November, Sir Francis Bryan and Peter Vaughan went to Rome to make a case for the document being a forgery. They were soon followed by William Knight, William Bennett, and then on the 22nd of January 1529, Stephen Gardiner was again sent to remonstrate with the Pope. In the midst of these events, news arrived that the Pope had died. Wolsey reacted with all haste, prompting Henry to issue royal instructions to advocate, yet again, the English Cardinal's Medici successor. The news was wrong. The Pope was ill, but not terminally so. However, he was not yet well enough to give proper consideration to the problems arising from the sudden production of the brief. On the 21st of April 1529, in Rome, Gardiner wrote a personal letter to the king saying that all could be realistically expected from Clement was prevarication and delay over the brief, and indeed anything else to do with the divorce. The pontiff was in poor health, and Gardiner's advice was to let Campeggio and Wolsey proceed with the trial in London. It was on the same day that the Pope himself wrote to Henry, regretting he could not pronounce the brief a forgery without hearing both sides. Gardiner, by instructions dated the 7th of May 1529, was called home. His services were required by the King in England. At the same time, Gardiner was writing personally to the King. He had gleaned information about the handling of matters that he wanted kept secret from Wolsey and Campeggio. At the same time, Wolsey instructed Gardiner to forge a document for the Pope to sign and seal. However, Clement was not fooled by that. Wolsey was in trouble whichever way he turned. Trouble from Catherine, trouble from Charles, who had detested him for years, and trouble from the many English people across all classes who now ridiculed him. Anne Boleyn for now suffered him. Henry, however, remained his friend. He needed the cardinal and was fearful of the world without him. There were members of the nobility and gentry who were sharpening some very long and deadly knives, and they were going to use them against him. The clock had been ticking for some time. Previously, in April 1528, Margaret, governor of the Netherlands, had sent word with the Windsor Herald to Wolsey that some people in authority were making great efforts to achieve peace between Charles and Francis without the cardinal's interference or that of his sovereign. She confirmed these intentions to him directly in a personal communication a couple of days later. The clandestine negotiations continued until the spring of 1529, by which time they were sufficiently advanced for the French and the Imperialists to meet face to face at Cambrai that summer. The legatine trial at Blackfriars in London began on the 18th of June. At the same time, the summit of Cambrai began. Cambrai is situated on the frontiers of France in the Low Countries. It was a small ecclesiastical independent state chosen for the convention because of its neutrality. Such was their animosity towards each other that when the time came, neither Charles nor Francis was present to face the other in person. The French were represented by Louise, Francis's mother, and his sister Anne Boleyn's kindred spirit, Marguerite. The Imperialists were represented by Margaret, Governor of the Netherlands. Thomas Wolsey was desperate to be there. He had staked everything on his friendship with France to realise his papal aspirations, and now feared that Francis's mother would, on her son's behalf, desert him and make peace with the very man he abhorred, the man against whom he sought revenge, and had worked for years to topple. The frustrated cardinal, even he, could not body himself in two places at the same time. A few days before the Blackfriars trial was underway, he encouraged the French ambassador, Jean du Bellay, to engineer a delay to the Cambrai talks until the divorce trial was finished. By prolonging the war against Charles and Italy, he wanted French military action to capture Milan and Parma.
A cambio de una generosa compensación, claro está. Y que la misma concordia haga posible que vuestro hijo renuncie a sus derechos sobre el milanesado.
Es mi hijo el que exige la devolución del ducado a su legítimo dueño.
Así no llegaremos a un entendimiento.
Tomemos un descanso para meditar en qué podemos ceder, pues ambas habremos de hacerlo.
That was not to be. Henry and the Boleyns kept Wolsey in London and sent Cuthbert Tunstall, at that time Bishop of London, and Sir Thomas More instead.
Ha levantado el cerco a Nápoles y combate al lado del emperador. Todo está perdido.
La archiduquesa aún no lo sabe. Utilizaremos eso a nuestro favor.
Francis did actually make one more effort to conquer Milan, but his forces were cut to pieces at Landriano on the 21st of June, 1529. As a consequence of this, the latest French failure, the Pope announced that he had quite made up his mind to become an imperialist and live and die as such. 8 days after the Battle of Landriano, the Treaty of Barcelona was signed. The treaty was a pact between the Pope's Medici family and Charles's Habsburg family. To seal the arrangement, Pope Clement's nephew, Alessandro de' Medici, Duke of Florence, was married to the Emperor's illegitimate daughter, Margaret of Parma, a future regent of the Netherlands. Medici rule was to be re-established in Florence, and Wolsey and Campeggio's commission to Henry to try the suit for divorce from Catherine, well, that was revoked. On the 6th of July, Pope broke the news to Castile that he had decided to allow Catherine her appeal and therefore call the case to Rome.
Vuestro hijo no ha asolado los campos de Italia para conformarse con migajas, a no ser que la marcha de la guerra ya no le sea favorable.
¿Sabéis lo que estáis haciendo?
Decídmelo vos. O esperamos a que llegue el
Campeggio and Wolsey knew that was on its way. It was an integral part of the charade. However, Campeggio played his part to the full and announced to a shocked legatine court on the 23rd of July, before the official notification arrived from the Pope, that he would not make a decision and would adjourn the case for the duration of the summer holidays, as was the legal practice in Rome. Charles Brandon, Henry's mate, was furious, and he heckled that there was never merry in England whilst we had cardinals amongst us. This was a futile loss of temper, because at the end of July, soon after the court was suspended, news of the appeal reached England, and the Legatine Court never sat again. Anne Boleyn was even more trenchant than Brandon in her letter to Wolsey. On the 28th of July, Stephen Gardiner replaced Wolsey as principal secretary to the king. Gardiner would now work in attendance on the king, and within a week of Wolsey losing that job, the Treaty of Cambrai was signed, then sealed, and with that there was no hope of him ever becoming Pope.
Firmad con honor lo que vuestro ejército no ha sabido defender en el campo de batalla. A vos nada se os puede reprochar.
¿Qué honor encontráis en renunciar a los derechos de mi hijo sobre el milanesado, Flandes y Artois, a cambio de conservar la Borgoña? ¿Cuándo recuperará Francia sus rehenes?
Cuando vuestro hijo reclame que su legítima esposa, hermana del emperador, se reúna con él.
There was no way back for Wolsey, and a little over a year later, he was dead. These determined women were united in their desire to end a hitherto ceaseless war, and so end the career and ultimately the life of the scheming cleric Thomas Wolsey. For too long he had lived his life as the rejoicing third. Too long he had secretly pitted one side against the other to suit only his purpose. The wars in Christendom had been created by him, at first to destroy Francis, until he changed sides to ruin Charles. Too long he had devised plots, intrigues, and conspiracies to satisfy his own ambitions, and for too long he had exploited the church and manipulated his nitwit sovereign purely to quench his lust, privilege, power, and the papacy. Christendom had become wise to his duplicity, and now Christendom had no further use for him. In the whole world he had only one friend, Henry VIII. But now with Wolsey gone there would be peace. Despite even his last desperate efforts to prolong the war, there would be peace. The cardinal was a megalomaniac, drunk on omnipotence and grandeur. He was intoxicated by a supreme clerical power, a power that had been despised and venerated in varying degrees, almost without interruption, for centuries. In my opinion, Wolsey poisoned himself at Leicester Abbey on the 29th of November 1530, while he was in the custody of Sir William Kingston and travelling with his biographer George Cavendish. Kingston was returning Wolsey under arrest to face trial in London. However, much water had flowed under the bridge since the Peace of Cambrai and the 29th of November 1530. In the next episode, we analyse the process that took place eliminating the megalomaniac cardinal and the reasons most certainly do not hang on the failure of him gaining an annulment of Henry VIII's marriage. What the process did do, however, was alter the course of English history, its landscape, the church, and its parliament. So don't miss the next exciting episode of Henry VIII the Reign, An Old Tale of Wives.